The frost came down like a curse on the Texas Panhandle in late November of 1887, and Sarah Monroe watched her bees fall from the sky like tiny angels denied heaven. She stood in the yard behind her small ranch house, her breath making clouds in air that had no business being this cold. Not here, not in a place where summer could bake a man's brain inside his skull. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 18 degrees, and it was only noon. Sarah wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked toward the 6 wooden hives arranged in neat rows near the edge of her property. Her boots crunched through grass that had turned brittle overnight, each blade coated in a silver sheen of ice that would have been beautiful if it was not killing everything she had worked 3 years to build. The bees were clustered at the entrances of their hives, their bodies moving slower than molasses in January. Some had already fallen to the ground, their legs curled inward, their wings still. Sarah knelt down and picked up one of the dying insects, cradling it in her palm. She could feel the faint vibration of life still thrumming through its tiny body, but it was fading fast. Without the bees, there would be no honey to sell in town. Without the honey, there would be no money for supplies. Without supplies, she would lose the ranch her father had left her when he died 2 years ago, the only thing she had left of him besides his pocket watch, and a few faded photographs. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. The sound of hooves on frozen ground carried differently in cold air, sharper somehow, more insistent. Sarah stood up, shading her eyes against the weak winter sun, and watched as a man on a dark bay gelding rode up the long path to her house. He sat tall in the saddle, his shoulders broad beneath a heavy canvas coat, his hat pulled low against the wind that had started to pick up from the north. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his hat, and a face that was sun-weathered but handsome in a rugged, unpolished way. His eyes, when he finally looked directly at her, were the color of strong coffee. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. "Name is James Cordell. I was passing through on my way to the Rocking T Ranch when I saw your place here. Been riding since dawn and my horse could use some water if you can spare it." Sarah studied him for a moment, the way she had learned to study all strangers who came to her door. Living alone on a ranch, even a small one, meant being careful. But there was something honest in his face, something open and direct in the way he met her gaze without staring, without making assumptions. She was 23 years old and had been managing on her own long enough to know the difference between a man who respected a woman and one who saw her as prey. "There is a trough by the barn," she said, gesturing toward the weathered structure that leaned slightly to the east, a project her father had never finished straightening. "Help yourself. Water is free to travelers." James dismounted in one smooth motion and led his horse toward the trough. Sarah watched as he let the animal drink, his hand resting gently on its neck, murmuring something too low for her to hear. When the horse had drunk its fill, he walked it over to a patch of dead grass near the barn and ground-tied it before walking back toward Sarah. His gait was easy, unhurried, the walk of a man comfortable in his own skin. "You got a problem with your bees," he said. It was not a question. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. "That obvious?" "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," James said, moving closer to the hives. He knelt down where she had been standing moments before, picking up one of the fallen bees with surprising gentleness. "My mother kept hives. Lost a whole bunch of them one winter when the cold came early and stayed late. Broke her heart." He looked up at Sarah, and there was understanding in his eyes, the kind that came from shared loss. "These hives are going to freeze solid if the temperature keeps dropping. The bees cluster together to stay warm, but they can only generate so much heat. When it gets this cold, they cannot maintain the temperature they need to survive." "I know," Sarah said quietly. She came to stand beside him, looking down at her dying colonies. "But I do not know what to do about it." I have blankets in the house, but I do not think that would be enough, and I cannot afford to lose them. The honey sales are what keep this place running." James was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Then he stood up, brushing the frost from his knees, and walked around the hives, examining them from different angles. Sarah watched him, noting the careful way he moved, the attention he paid to small details like the direction of the wind and the exposure of each hive to the elements. "We could build shelters," he said finally. "Windbreaks around each hive, something to trap the heat they generate and protect them from the worst of the cold. It would take some lumber and time, but it might work. Probably will work if we do it right and do it fast." Sarah felt a flutter of hope in her chest, but she tamped it down. Hope was a dangerous thing when you had been disappointed as many times as she had. "Why would you help me? You said you were heading to the rocking tea. They will be expecting you." James turned to look at her fully, and Sarah felt the intensity of his gaze like a physical thing. "The rocking tea is not expecting me until I show up. I am just a drifter looking for work, not somebody they sent for, but your bees, they need help now, today. Tomorrow might be too late." He paused, then added, "And maybe I am tired of drifting. Maybe I would like to do something that matters, even if it is just for a couple of days." Sarah searched his face for signs of deception, for the hidden motives that men usually had when they offered help to a woman alone. But all she saw was sincerity and something else she could not quite name. Loneliness, perhaps. The same kind of loneliness she felt every night when she sat by her fire with only the wind for company. "All right," she said, "but I will pay you for your work. I do not take charity." "I was not offering charity," James said with a slight smile. "I was offering help. There is a difference." They spent the rest of that afternoon planning the shelters. James sketched designs in the dirt with a stick, explaining how they would build three-sided windbreaks around each hive, open to the south to allow the bees to come and go on warmer days, but closed to the north and west, where the worst winds came from. They would use whatever lumber Sarah had, supplemented by branches and anything else they could find. The key was insulation and wind protection, creating a microclimate around each hive that would give the bees a fighting chance. Sarah led James to the barn where her father had stored building supplies. There were planks of pine and oak, some warped with age but still usable, along with nails, a hammer, and a saw that needed sharpening. It was not much, but James assessed the materials with a practiced eye and declared it would be enough if they were careful. "We will start first thing in the morning," he said as the sun began to set, painting the frozen landscape in shades of orange and gold. "But tonight we should wrap the hives in whatever you have, burlap sacks, old blankets, anything to help them through until we can get the shelters built." They worked in the gathering darkness, Sarah bringing out every spare piece of fabric she owned while James carefully draped them over the hives, securing them with twine so they would not blow away in the wind. His hands moved with confident efficiency, and Sarah found herself watching the way his fingers worked, quick and sure. When he looked up and caught her staring, she felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly looked away. "You should come inside," she said when they had finished. "I can make supper." "It is the least I can do." James hesitated, and Sarah could see the internal debate playing across his features. Propriety said he should thank her and ride on, find somewhere else to spend the night. But practicality said it was getting dark and the temperature was still dropping, and his horse would fare better in her barn than exposed to the elements. "I would be grateful," he said finally, "but I will sleep in the barn. I do not want to cause talk." "There is no one around to talk," Sarah said. "The nearest neighbor is 5 miles south. But the barn is warm enough, I suppose. I will bring you blankets and food." Inside her house, Sarah lit the lamps and stirred the fire back to life, adding logs until the flames crackled and roared. She had beef stew left over from the day before, and she heated it while making fresh biscuits, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind wandered to the man settling his horse in her barn. James Cordell. The name suited him somehow, solid and unpretentious. She wondered what had brought him to Texas, what had made him into a drifter. He had the look of someone running from something, but also the look of someone who might be ready to stop running. When the food was ready, she filled 2 bowls and wrapped the biscuits in a clean cloth. She pulled on her coat and carried everything out to the barn, the cold biting at her exposed skin. James had lit a lantern and made a bed for himself in an empty stall, piling hay into a nest and spreading his bedroll over it. His horse was settled in the next stall, munching contentedly on the oats Sarah had told him to take from the feed bin. "This smells wonderful," James said when she handed him the bowl. He waited until she sat down on an overturned bucket before he started eating, another small gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the warmth of the food spreading through their bodies, the sounds of the horse and the wind outside creating a kind of cocoon around them. "Why bees?" James asked eventually. "It is not common for a woman to keep bees." "It is not common for anyone out here, really. Most folks stick to cattle or crops," Sarah smiled, remembering. "My father was always interested in unusual things. When I was a girl, maybe 10 or 11, a traveling merchant came through selling everything from patent medicines to books to beehive starter kits. My father bought one on a whim, said it would be an adventure. My mother thought he was crazy." Her smile faded. "She died the next year, fever. After that, the bees became something we did together, just him and me. When he passed, I kept them going. It felt like keeping a part of him alive." James nodded slowly. "I understand that. My father died when I was 16, kicked by a horse. My mother never really recovered from it. She passed a few years later, just seemed to fade away. The farm went to my older brother and I did not fit there anymore, not without them, so I left." "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked. "Leaving? Sometimes," James admitted, "but staying would have been worse. My brother and I, we never saw eye to eye. He wanted to run things his way and I wanted to honor what our parents had built. We would have ended up hating each other." He set down his empty bowl and looked at Sarah. "What about you? Ever think about leaving? Selling this place and starting over somewhere easier?" "Every day," Sarah said honestly. "But then I think about my father, about all the work he put into this land, and I cannot do it. It would feel like betraying him. Plus, where would I go? A woman alone does not have many options. At least here I have a roof over my head and land under my feet." "You have more than that," James said quietly. "You have courage. It takes real strength to stay and fight when leaving would be easier." Sarah felt something shift in the air between them, something electric and dangerous and thrilling all at once. She stood up quickly, collecting the bowls. "I should let you get some rest. We have a big day tomorrow." "Sarah," James said, and the sound of her name in his voice made her pause at the barn door. "Thank you for trusting me, for the food and the shelter. It has been a long time since anyone showed me kindness without wanting something in return." "You are helping me save my bees," Sarah said. "That is not nothing." She walked back to the house through the freezing night, her heart beating faster than the cold warranted. Inside, she banked the fire and climbed into her bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin. But sleep was a long time coming. She kept thinking about brown eyes and gentle hands, about the way James had looked at her like she was someone worth seeing. The next morning dawned even colder than the day before. Sarah woke before sunrise and dressed quickly, layering on every warm thing she owned. She made coffee and heated water for washing, then prepared a breakfast of eggs and bacon and leftover biscuits. When she stepped outside to call James, she found him already up, checking on the wrapped hives with a worried expression. 2 degrees, he said, pointing at the thermometer. "We need to work fast." They ate quickly and then got to work. James marked out where each shelter would go, ensuring there was enough room to work around the hives when needed. Then he began cutting lumber to length while Sarah gathered branches from the scrub trees that dotted her property. They worked side by side, falling into an easy rhythm. James would cut and fit the boards, and Sarah would hand him nails or hold pieces steady while he hammered them into place. The first shelter took them most of the morning. It was a simple structure, 3 walls made of overlapping boards with a slanted roof to shed snow if any came. James filled the gaps between boards with dried grass and mud, creating insulation. When it was done, they carefully positioned it around the first hive, removing the temporary blankets only after the shelter was in place. "Look," Sarah said, pointing. Through the entrance of the hive, they could see bees beginning to move with more energy, responding to the slightly warmer air inside the shelter. "It is working," James said with satisfaction. 5 more to go." They worked through the afternoon, their hands growing numb despite the gloves they wore, their backs aching from bending and lifting. But they did not stop, driven by urgency and something else, something that thrived in the shared purpose and the growing connection between them. Sarah found herself watching James when she thought he was not looking, admiring the way he moved, the competence in everything he did. And sometimes she would look up to find him watching her too, his eyes warm despite the cold. By the time the sun was setting, they had completed 3 shelters. It was not enough, but James declared they had done all they could for the day. They were both exhausted, their muscles trembling with fatigue. Sarah made supper while James tended to the animals, and when he came in stomping his feet against the cold, she handed him a cup of hot coffee without a word. "You should eat inside tonight," she said. "It is too cold for the barn." James started to protest, but Sarah cut him off. "I am not worried about propriety right now. I am worried about you freezing to death in my barn. Sit down and eat." He sat, and they shared another meal at her small kitchen table. The house felt different with him in it, more alive somehow. They talked about Missouri and Texas, about farming and ranching, about the books they had read, and the places they hoped to see someday. Sarah learned that James could read and write, that his mother had insisted on education even when it meant working by lamplight after a full day in the fields. He learned that Sarah had taught herself beekeeping from a manual her father had ordered from back east, that she could shoot a rifle as well as any man, and that she secretly loved music even though she had never learned to play an instrument. "My mother played piano," James said. "On Sundays after church, she would play and my father would sing. He had a terrible voice, completely tone-deaf, but she never told him. She just played and smiled and loved him for trying." "That is what love is," Sarah said softly. "Seeing someone fully and loving them not despite their flaws but including them." Their eyes met across the table, and Sarah felt her breath catch. There was a question in James's gaze, a tentative hope that mirrored what she was feeling, but neither of them spoke it aloud. It was too soon, too fragile. So instead, James cleared his throat and said he should get some sleep, and Sarah showed him to the small spare room that had been her father's. "Are you sure?" he asked at the doorway. "I do not want to presume." "You are not presuming," Sarah said. "You are accepting hospitality. There is a difference." She lay in her own bed that night, acutely aware of James sleeping just on the other side of the wall. She could hear the occasional creak of the bed frame as he shifted position, and the sound made her feel less alone than she had in years. It was both comforting and terrifying, this feeling that was growing inside her chest. She barely knew this man. He had been here less than 2 days, and yet something in her recognized something in him, a matching piece of a puzzle she had not known she was trying to solve. Morning brought slightly warmer temperatures, a reprieve that James said would not last. They worked with renewed energy, building the 4th and 5th shelters. Sarah's hands were blistered now despite the gloves, and she could see that James was favoring his left shoulder, probably strained from all the hammering. But neither complained. They were too close to finishing. The 6th and final shelter went up just as the sun reached its apex. It was not as pretty as the others, cobbled together from scraps and branches, but it would do the job. James secured the last nail and then stepped back, surveying their work with satisfaction. 6 hives, 6 shelters, he said. Your bees have a fighting chance now. Sarah walked from shelter to shelter, peering into each one. The bees were definitely more active, the temperature inside the little structures several degrees warmer than the outside air. She could hear the humming that meant life, that meant survival. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back, turning to James with a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "We did it," she said. "I cannot believe we actually did it." "You did it," James corrected. "I just helped. These are your bees, your dream, your fight." "I was just lucky enough to be passing by at the right time." "Lucky," Sarah repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose it was luck or fate or something." They stood there in the cold afternoon light, looking at each other, and Sarah knew that something irrevocable had shifted. This was not just gratitude she was feeling, not just appreciation for his help. This was deeper, more complicated, more real. She could see in James's eyes that he felt it too, this pull between them that had nothing to do with bees or cold snaps or survival. "I should probably head out soon," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The rocking tea is still looking for hands, I imagine. Or you could stay," Sarah heard herself say. The words were out before she could stop them, reckless and hopeful and terrifying. "The ranch is small, but I could use help. The shelters will need monitoring through the winter, and there are always repairs that need doing, and I cannot pay much, but I can offer room and board and—" She trailed off, suddenly embarrassed by her own boldness. James took a step closer. And I would like you to stay," Sarah said quietly. "Not because I need help, though I do, but because I do not want you to leave. These past 2 days, working beside you, talking with you, it has felt right in a way nothing has felt right since my father died. And maybe that is crazy because we barely know each other, but I think sometimes you just know. You feel it in your bones." "I feel it too," James said. He reached out and took her hand, and even through their gloves Sarah could sense the warmth of his touch. "I have been drifting for 3 years, telling myself I was looking for something but never knowing what. And then I rode up here and saw you standing in your yard with frost in your hair and worry in your eyes, and I thought maybe this is it. Maybe this is what I have been looking for." "A woman and her dying bees," Sarah said with a shaky laugh. "A home," James said simply. "A place to matter, a reason to stay." He pulled off his glove and then hers, and when his skin touched hers, it felt like a promise. They stood there holding hands in the cold November afternoon, surrounded by the shelters they had built together, and Sarah felt something hard and scared inside her chest begin to soften. "So you will stay?" she asked. "I will stay," James confirmed, "if you will have me." "I will have you," Sarah said, and then they were kissing, a gentle collision of cold lips and warm breath that sent heat flooding through her entire body. It was a first kiss and a last kiss all at once, the kind of kiss that marked an ending and a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and smiling, the world seemed brighter somehow, despite the cold. The winter that followed was the hardest Sarah could remember, but also the sweetest. The cold snap lasted for 3 weeks, with temperatures dropping below 0 on several nights. But the hives survived, protected by their shelters and tended daily by Sarah and James. They would check each one every morning and evening, making sure the ventilation was adequate but the warmth was retained, watching for signs of distress or disease. In between caring for the bees, James threw himself into improving the ranch. He fixed the lean on the barn, replaced rotted boards in the corral fence, and repaired the roof where it had been leaking into the kitchen during rains. Sarah worked beside him whenever she could, learning skills her father had never taught her, marveling at how much easier everything was with a partner. But it was not just about the work. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk for hours, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for their futures. James told her about the places he had been in his years of drifting, the odd jobs he had worked, the people he had met. Sarah told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother's gentle hands and her father's big laugh, about the loneliness that had threatened to swallow her after they were both gone. "You are not alone anymore," James said one night, reaching across to take her hand. They were sitting on the worn sofa her parents had brought from Tennessee, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I am here, and I am not going anywhere. Promise?" Sarah asked, hating how small her voice sounded, how vulnerable. "Promise," James said firmly. He shifted to face her fully, his expression serious. "Sarah, I know we have not known each other long. By conventional standards, this is all happening too fast, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness, and the way you fight for what is yours. I love how you talk to your bees like they are your children. I love waking up knowing I get to spend another day beside you." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were good tears, the kind that came from too much happiness contained in too small a space. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started loving you when you knelt down and picked up that first dying bee like it mattered. Like it was worth saving." "Everything is worth saving if you love it enough," James said, and then he was kissing her again, deeper this time, with a passion that made her forget about the cold and the bees and everything except the feeling of his arms around her and his heart beating against hers. They were married in January of 1888, in the small church in town with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and James wore his only good suit, brushed clean for the occasion. The ceremony was simple, just vows and rings that James had bought with money he had been saving. But when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah felt like the richest woman in Texas. The ride back to the ranch, their ranch now, was cold but beautiful. Snow had fallen the night before, dusting the landscape in white, making everything look clean and new. James drove the wagon with one arm around Sarah, keeping her close against his side, and she leaned into his warmth and felt utterly content. "What are you thinking?" James asked as they turned onto the long path leading home. "I am thinking about how everything can change in an instant," Sarah said. "One day I was alone and frightened, watching my bees die and thinking I would lose everything. The next day you rode up, a stranger offering help. And now here we are, married, starting a life together. It feels like a miracle." "Not a miracle," James said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Just two people who were brave enough to take a chance on each other. The first year of their marriage was not easy. The ranch barely made enough to support one person, let alone two, and they had to be careful with every penny. But James took work on neighboring ranches when he could spare the time, and Sarah's honey production increased as her colonies grew stronger. They planted a garden in the spring, and Sarah canned vegetables while James built her a proper bee house where she could extract honey and tend to frames without exposure to the elements. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, the way married couples do. Sarah discovered that James was grumpy in the mornings until he had his coffee, and that he sang when he thought no one was listening. Old songs his mother had taught him. James learned that Sarah needed time alone with her bees, that it was how she processed her thoughts and emotions, and that she cried at sad stories but never at her own pain. They fought sometimes, small arguments about money or chores or decisions that needed making. But they always made up before bed, neither willing to let anger fester into something bigger. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroom, they discovered each other in ways that deepened their connection beyond words. In the fall of 1888, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She told James one evening after supper, nervous about how he would react. They had not planned for children yet, still struggling to make the ranch profitable, still finding their footing as a couple. But James's face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen. He picked her up and spun her around the kitchen, laughing and whooping like a boy. "We are having a baby," he kept saying. "Sarah, we are having a baby. You are happy?" she asked when he finally set her down, breathless and dizzy. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," James said, cupping her face in his hands. "You have given me everything, Sarah. A home, a purpose, a love I never thought I would find, and now a child. I do not have words for what I am feeling right now." The pregnancy was hard. Sarah was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down. James took over all the bee work and most of the housework, insisting she rest as much as possible. As her belly grew, so did his protectiveness. He would not let her lift anything heavy or climb ladders or do any of the 100 dangerous things that ranch life required. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Sarah would protest, but secretly she loved his attentiveness, the way he fussed over her. Their son was born in June of 1889 during a thunderstorm that shook the house and made the animals restless. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when James, holding Sarah's hand and wiping her brow, thought he might lose her. But she was strong, his Sarah, stronger than anyone he had ever known. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and squalling, James wept openly with relief and joy. "What should we name him?" Sarah asked, exhausted but glowing as she held their son against her chest. James looked at the tiny face, the perfect fingers, the shock of dark hair. "What about Henry, after your father?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Henry Cordell, yes, I love it. Papa would have loved it. Becoming parents changed everything and nothing." The ranch still demanded attention, the bees still needed tending, money was still tight. But now there was Henry, needing to be fed and changed and held, filling the house with his cries and gurgles and, eventually, his laughter. James proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle, singing the same songs to his son that his mother had sung to him. Sarah would watch them together, James walking the floor with Henry on his shoulder in the middle of the night, and feel so full of love she thought she might burst. The years rolled by, marked by small triumphs and setbacks. In 1890, a drought threatened the wildflowers that the bees needed for nectar, but James dug an irrigation system that kept Sarah's planted bee garden alive. In 1891, the price of honey dropped and they struggled to make ends meet, but James found work breaking horses for a neighboring ranch, and they scraped through. In 1892, Sarah's bee operation expanded to 10 hives, and the honey sales finally brought in enough that James could turn down outside work and focus on their own land. Henry grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved the bees as much as his mother did. By the age of 4, he was following Sarah around the hives, dressed in a tiny beekeeper's veil James had fashioned from netting, asking endless questions about queens and drones and how honey was made. Sarah taught him gently, the way her father had taught her, and watching them together gave James a sense of continuity, of legacy. In 1893, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. Their daughter was born in March of 1894, during the first warm spell of spring when the bees were just beginning to venture out after winter. They named her Grace, for the grace of God that had brought them all together and sustained them through the hard times. Grace was a quieter baby than Henry had been, more contemplative. She would lie in her cradle for hours, watching the patterns of sunlight on the ceiling, perfectly content. As she grew, it became clear that she had inherited her father's musical ear. James taught her the songs his mother had taught him, and by the age of 3, Grace could carry a tune better than most adults. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. James expanded their cattle operation, starting with just a few head and gradually building a respectable herd. Sarah's honey became known throughout the county for its quality, and she began getting orders from stores in distant towns. They saved money carefully, planning for the future, for the day when Henry and Grace might want to strike out on their own or expand the family operation. But more than the material success, it was the life they had built together that mattered. On Sunday afternoons, James would take his family on picnics down by the creek that ran through their property. They would spread blankets under the cottonwood trees and eat Sarah's fried chicken and biscuits while the children splashed in the shallow water. James would play made-up games with Henry and Grace, chasing them through the grass while they shrieked with laughter, and Sarah would watch with a smile that never quite left her face. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, James and Sarah would sit on the porch they had built together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. They would watch the sun set over their land, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, and talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes James would sing softly, and Sarah would hum along, and the bees in their shelters would add their own humming harmony. "Do you ever think about that day I rode up here?" James asked one such evening in the fall of 1896. 9 years had passed since that frozen November morning, 9 years of work and love and growth. "All the time," Sarah said. "I think about how close I came to losing everything. The bees, the ranch, my hope, and then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had not even known how to pray." "I think about it too," James said. "How different my life would be if I had ridden past, if I had not stopped for water. I would have ended up at the Rocking T or some other ranch, just another hired hand drifting from place to place. Instead, I found home. I found you." Sarah tilted her head up to look at him, this man who had saved her bees and stolen her heart. There was gray in his hair now, lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. But he was still the same James who had knelt in the frost to pick up a dying bee, who had worked for 2 days straight to build shelters without asking for anything in return, who had looked at her and seen someone worth staying for. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they had been that first time, maybe more true for all the years and experiences that had deepened them. "I love you too," James said, and kissed her as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and new joys. Henry grew into a tall, serious young man who shared his father's practical nature and his mother's determination. Grace remained gentle and musical, but with a core of steel that surprised people who underestimated her. Both children learned the value of hard work and the importance of family, lessons taught not through words but through example. In 1899, when Henry was 10 and Grace was 5, a second cold snap hit the Texas Panhandle, not as severe as the one in 1887 but bad enough to threaten the hives again. This time, though, Sarah and James were prepared. They had maintained and improved the original shelters over the years, and when the cold came, they simply buttoned everything up and waited it out. The bees survived without casualties, and when spring came, they emerged strong and ready to work. "Remember when we built these?" Sarah said to James as they checked the hives after the cold had passed. "You had been here less than a day, and we were working like we had known each other forever." "I did know you," James said. "Maybe not the details, but the important parts. I knew you were someone who loved fiercely and fought hard for what was hers. I knew you were someone I wanted to know better, and I was right." Sarah laughed and kissed him, unbothered by the children's exaggerated groans of disgust. "You are still right," she said, "about all of it." As the new century dawned, James and Sarah found themselves in their 30s, no longer the young couple who had taken a chance on each other, but seasoned partners who had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. The ranch was thriving, the children were healthy and happy, and the love between them had only grown stronger with time. They added more hives, expanded the cattle operation, and bought an adjacent parcel of land when the neighbor decided to move back east. Henry began talking about becoming a veterinarian, fascinated by animal health, while Grace showed an interest in teaching, wanting to share knowledge the way her mother had shared the secrets of beekeeping with her. Through it all, the shelters remained, weathered now but still standing, a testament to what could be accomplished when two people worked together toward a common goal. James repaired them each fall, getting them ready for winter, and sometimes Sarah would stand and watch him work, remembering that desperate November when everything had hung in the balance. "Thank you," she said to him one such afternoon when he was replacing boards on the 4th shelter. "For what?" James asked, looking up from his work. "For stopping that day," Sarah said. "For seeing what needed doing and doing it, for staying, for loving me, for building this life with me." James set down his hammer and came to her, pulling her into his arms. "Sarah Cordell, you have been the making of me. Before you, I was just drifting, going nowhere, being nobody. You gave me purpose and family and a reason to wake up grateful every morning. I should be thanking you." "Then we will thank each other," Sarah said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "For being brave enough to trust what we felt, even when it did not make sense. For choosing each other every single day." As they stood there among the bee shelters, the sun warm on their faces and the sound of their children playing in the distance, Sarah thought about fate and luck and divine intervention. Maybe it had been all three that brought James to her door that frozen November morning. Or maybe it had just been the simple human need for connection, the universal desire to find someone who sees you and loves you and chooses to stay. Whatever it was, Sarah was grateful. Grateful for her bees that had brought them together. Grateful for the cold that had made their help necessary. Grateful for every single moment that had led to this life they had built. Years later, when Henry and Grace had children of their own, they would ask Sarah and James to tell the story of how they met. And James would start with riding up to find a beautiful woman standing among dying bees, and Sarah would add details about building shelters in the freezing cold. And together, they would weave the tale of two lonely people who found each other at exactly the right moment. "The moral of the story," James would always finish, winking at his grandchildren, "is that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst situations. Your grandmother's bees were dying and it broke her heart, but if they had not been dying, I would have ridden right past. And we would have missed out on all of this." "All of what?" the grandchildren would ask, even though they had heard the story 100 times. "All of this love," Sarah would answer, taking James's hand. "All of this family. All of this life that we built together, one day at a time, one hive at a time, one choice at a time." And the grandchildren would nod wisely, understanding in the way children do that they were witnessing something precious, something rare, something worth aspiring to. They would see the way their grandparents looked at each other, still finding joy in each other's faces after decades of marriage, and they would know what love was supposed to look like. In the end, the story of Sarah and James was not a complicated one. It was simply the story of two people who found each other when they most needed finding, who worked together to solve a problem, and who discovered in that work the foundation of something lasting. It was a story about bees and cold and shelters, but more than that, it was a story about recognizing home when you find it, even in the most unexpected places and people. The bee shelters stood for many years after James and Sarah were gone, a physical reminder of where it all began. Their children maintained them, and their grandchildren after that, keeping the family tradition of beekeeping alive. And every winter, when the cold came down and the bees needed protection, someone would check the shelters and remember the story of how love and hard work and a little bit of luck had saved not just the bees, but two human hearts as well. The ranch remained in the family for generations, growing and changing with the times, but always keeping bees, always remembering. And on cold November nights, when the wind howled from the north and the temperature dropped, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the humming of bees in their shelters, and the echoes of laughter from two people who had found their forever in the frozen Texas panhandle over 100 years before.